It is currently 3 a.m. in the morning. I'm currently at Lake City Lodge, which is in Lake City. Planning to drive to the Grizzly Gulch trailhead, which is where you start the hike to Handies Peak, which is a 14er in the San Juan mountain range. I'm actually looking to do 2 hikes back to back. Straight after my hike today, I'm then going to drive to Silverton, and then I'm going to hike to Ice Lake. The Ice Lake just looks super beautiful, and I'm really looking forward to that. So I'm just going to eat some breakfast and make my way over to the trailhead. I'll speak to you when I get there. I am currently at the Grizzly Gulch trailhead. There's like 2 routes, I guess, to get to Handies Peak. The one that I'm going to be doing here, the east slopes, is supposed to be a little bit steeper or harder, but it's a lot more scenic. And so the road down there to American Basin, the road to the trailhead is a lot worse than what I just did. It should take about maybe 5-6 hours round trip. As per usual, I'll keep you updated when the sun has risen. All right, so we're now about 1 hour into the trail, and I've decided to strategically to stop at this point because I did learn that behind me there, that's a columbine flower, which apparently is the Colorado state flower. Right, so we are now over 2.5 hours into the hike. From all the hikes I've done so far, this one looks different. The view is actually more beautiful behind me, as you can see. It's incredibly scenic. We've climbed up a decent amount of the base of the mountain, just finished the switchbacks. That's the actual summit behind me there, Handies Peak. But the view from this little mini summit, look at that.
Yeah. Much shorter. Yeah, my friend got it, so he's actually
Videos don't do it justice. I mean, I don't know the names of these mountains, right? But apparently, from the guys behind me, they're just pointing out all the other 14ers from this spot. Can't wait to summit this baby. I'm on the cusp of summiting. It was right there behind me. Did the most difficult part earlier, the steepest part of the whole hike, and then just as you got over the most difficult part, it then starts to plateau, and then you just see like a clear finish line all the way to the summit, baby. I'm going to take you guys with me on my first time summiting Handies Peak. There's already a couple of people here before me. Here we are. This is the summit of Handies Peak, baby. So this is the very next day. We stayed in Lake City for the night, hiked Handies Peak, hiked back down, then drove like 5 hours to Silverton to stay there at night, to then wake up the next day to come here, which is the South Mineral Campground. And this is the trailhead for the Ice Lake. No one else knows this, but I'm actually wearing swimming trunks right now on this hike as I want to dive into the Ice Lake. Apparently this is going to be quite a tough hike, maybe like 6 hours round trip. People say that it feels like a 14er. Don't have too much time, so I'll keep you updated. Just over half hour into the hike. The elevation is moderate, I would say, from the get-go, and just chosen this spot, being in the shade, just to take a little bit of a breather before we go back into the sun. 1 hour into my hike, and the elevation is starting to get to me. It's just sustained elevation. There's hardly any plateaus. But the good news is that we are almost halfway, maybe like 40% of the way there. In 1 hour is pretty good going, given that I think it takes people on average about 3 hours to get there. Right guys, so it's now been an hour and a half into the hike, and the trail has finally plateaued. I'm actually walking flat after slogging the first hour. There's some really nice views, open area, mountains, waterfalls, creeks. but one last push up and then hopefully we should make it. Right, so it's now 2 hours into the hike. This last bit's a killer. It's probably the steepest part of the entire hike. According to the All Trails map, the lake should just be right around this corner. So this is going to be my final little break before the end. Check this out, guys. This looks super nice. And the thing is, I can't see anyone in the lake. I just went for a swim in the ice lake. Wow, it's incredible. This is the first time in my life, right, that I've ever swam in an alpine lake. And this is the next level cold. But it's actually fine. I like it. I don't apply or use any filters, you know, my photos or my videos. The ice lake is literally as blue as you can see. It really is that blue. I feel very fortunate that I was able to do this in relatively good conditions. I mean, I'm looking at the sky now and I can definitely see some thick clouds gathering. So on that note, I am going to make a swift transition into the poker. This was like within the first half hour or so of the table opening. So we're at full table and everyone is pretty deep stacked. In this first interesting hand, the action folds to a middle position player and he decides to limp in for $5. The action then continues folding to the cutoff, who also decides to limp, and then I look down on the button with ace-jack offsuit. So I decide to put in a raise to $25. The action folds back to the middle position limper, who makes the call, and the cutoff also calls. We are now going 3 ways to the flop, which comes ace 4-4 with a flush draw. Action checks to me, and in this spot, given this flop texture, we have close to 100% c-bet, and I think in terms of sizings, going for a downsize to me makes the most sense. So I decide to continue for a c-bet to $20. Middle position then goes into the tank. He is considering his options before he then eventually decides to make the call. Cutoff then quickly makes the fold, so we are now going heads up to the turn. On the turn, the dealer puts out an offsuit 6. Villain in middle position now decides to snap check, and in this spot I think we can go either way here between double barreling and checking back. I think if we do double barrel and we choose a small sizing, that will allow us to continue barreling the river. But if we instead want to just bet twice and check river, then I think we should go for a larger sizing on the turn. On this occasion, I decided that I want to go for a triple barrel, so I decided to put in another bet of $60. Villain now goes deep into the tank, and after a little while, he then decides to raise. He decides to raise to $160. Now, this villain in question is someone who I have quite a bit of history with. In fact, I think he was the star, of one of my earlier vlogs. So my perception of this player is that he's actually pretty loose, likes to play a lot of hands, likes to call a lot of 3-bets with quite a wide range of different hands. So when this guy decides to check raise me for quite a small sizing on an ace 4-4 6 board, I am not feeling that great about it. The small check raise to me looks super strong and looks super value, and I just don't really see it ever as a bluff. There's only one type of hand that he's repping here, which is trip falls. After thinking all of this through, I reluctantly decide to make the fold. On this occasion, Villain was kind enough to show his hand, and he showed 6-4 suited for a turned boat. So yeah, pretty unfortunate flop, and we're going to be losing this first hand of the session. In this hand, the action folds to me in middle position, and I look down at pocket 6s. So I decide to put in the standard open here to $15. The action then folds to the small blind, who takes a peek of his cards before then deciding to put in a 3-bet to $60. Action folds back to me, and in this spot, given quite a relatively small 3-bet sizing, given that we're both like 1.5k deep, we have a pretty easy decision here, so we decide to continue with a flat call. We are now going heads up to the flop,
and the flop comes 7, 8, 9 with a flush draw. My perception of this player is that he's a pretty standard ABC player. So with that in mind, this flop texture, from my perspective, is really bad for villain's range. You should never really connect with this flop, and therefore we should have the range advantage in this spot. So as to no surprise, villain does decide to start with the check. Action's now on us, and I think in this spot it would be a mistake to check back. I think we definitely want to take over the betting lead here for at least a couple of reasons. First reason is we definitely want to be denying some equity versus his overcards like ace king, ace queen, and the other reason is if we are beat and villain does have an overpair, then we can apply a ton of pressure by triple barreling, because not only is villain in my mind unlikely to have connected with this flop, he is also unlikely to improve, and therefore will find it very difficult to withstand pressure on future streets. So with all this in mind, I decide to take over the betting lead and decide to bet $40. Villain then doesn't think for too long before making the call. We are now off to the turn card, and the turn comes an offsuit 3, so pretty much a complete brick. Villain now decides to snap check. I think in this spot now is when I want to start piling the pressure. I think we want to be sizing up the turn here so that we can then imply that we are going to be putting in a large barrel on the river if villain decides to call the turn. And I think I would be barreling pretty much all river cards except I think maybe like an ace or a king, maybe a queen as well. So with this in mind, I decide to size up the turn to $125. So even though I put all the thought in terms of what I was going to do on the river, it never mattered anyway because villain decided to make the fold. So we get to drag in our first semi-significant part of the session.
Yeah, quite interesting what you said there. I do agree with it. I mean, not that I know.
Right, so on to the next hand, which is a lot more meaty. In this hand, the action falls to the cutoff and he decides to come in for a raise to $15. The action then falls to me in the big blind and I look down at ace king offsuit. So versus this player that I'm pretty much expecting to get my 3-bet called at a very high frequency, I decide to size up my 3-bet just a little bit to $85. The action then falls all the way back to the cutoff, who doesn't think for too long before, unsurprisingly, making the call. So we are now heads up to the flop, and the flop comes ace jack 5 rainbow. So we have a really nice flop here to continue barreling with all of our value and also all of our bluffs. I think even a hand like 10s or 9s or 8s, we would still be c-betting for value here, given how wide of a range that I'm putting villain on. So in this spot, I decide to continue for a c-bet of $50. Villain now goes into the tank. He's staring me down before he then decides to put in a raise to $175. Now this raise, I don't think I really like too much from villain, objectively speaking. I mean, this is an ace high board, but not only is it an ace high board, it's a 2 high card board. And so for that reason, there is far less value hands that villain can be repping in the spot, as opposed to if the flop was something like ace 7, 6, where he could then have more sets, 2 pairs, and more natural semi-bluffs that would have decent equity versus my ace high holdings. And so for that reason, given that I've also played with this guy where he's made some pretty goofy and random bluffs, I decide that 3-betting the flop would therefore be a huge mistake. I think we want to keep his bluffs in here, as I think that's the only way we're going to get value in this hand. For that reason, I decide to continue with just a flat call. We are now off to the turn card, and the turn comes like a 9 of clubs, which brings in a backdoor flush. I decide to snap check, which probably makes the most sense given the action on the flop. And then villain decides to check back. As soon as villain decides to check, I've immediately discounted any hands that could have had us beat on the flop, and I think essentially he was just trying to fold out our random king queens and king jacks on the flop. So we are now off to the river card, and the river is not my favorite. It now pairs the board with another 9. So I decided to snap check here, given that I'm putting villain on squarely complete air, or he could actually potentially have a random 9x here. And given my perception of this player, he could totally have a 9x in this spot. Villain now goes deep into the tank, and after a while, he then decides to put in another bet on the river. He decides to bet $325. And in this spot, given we are pretty much at the top of our range, not much of a decision here for us, we decide to snap call, and then villain mucks. So we get to now drag in this decent pot. In this next interesting hand, there is an open from under the gun to $15. The action then folds all the way to the button who makes the call, and I look down in the small blind with Queen Jack of Spades. So I think if the pre-flop opener was from someone in middle to late position and then there was player who called in between, I think I would be more inclined to be squeezing with this hand rather than flatting. But given that the raise is coming from under the gun, I decided to just continue with the flat call, and the big blind folds. We are now going 3 ways to the flop, which comes ace 10 9 with 2 spades. So a pretty amazing flop for our hand. We decide to snap check as we would do pretty much our full range. Under the gun checks, and then button checks. So unfortunately we didn't get to see any bets going into this hand, as I would have loved to have come in for a big check raise. So we're now off to a free turn card, which does improve our hand, but not in quite the way that we would like. The turn card comes an offsuit jack. We now improve to a pair of jacks to go along with our straight and flush draws. So I think one line we could take with this hand is we could now lead from the small blind and then barrel river. If we do get raised, then we can put in a 3-bet. The second line that I had in my mind is that we could attempt for a second time to go for another check raise and then barrel river. So although we're going to be taking a risk if we do play a check and the action checks through, I think this line actually makes our hand look a lot stronger rather than leading the turn and then betting river. So for this reason, I decide to play a check, and then fortunately the under the gun player now decides to come in for a delay c-bet of just $15. The button makes the call, and the action's now back on us. So given that we're seeing quite a small bet sizing from the under the gun player, and also given that it's a delay c-bet, in my mind defines this range to kind of like medium strength hands that have decent showdown. So I'm thinking hands like ace queen of diamonds that decide to check the flop to kind of pot control. So essentially a hand that can't really improve on turn on river. So this is actually good news to me, as this means that there is actually a good chance that we could actually blast off our opponents off their hands when we decide to semi bluff and we don't improve on river cards. So we decide to check raise to $90. Under the gun now goes into the tank before eventually deciding to make the call. The button folds, so we are now going heads up to the river. On the river card, the dealer puts out a complete brick. I think the worst hand that we're probably up against here would be a hand like pocket queens or pocket kings, and most likely I think villain is most likely to have like an ace-x hand for like a top pair. I think if we decide to check here, villain is going to snap check back and we're going to be losing this hand all the time. So even though we do have middle pair here, I think we do need to turn this hand into a bluff. So I decide to bet $250. Villain then is going into the tank. He's smiling for a bit. He's kind of not quite sure what to do, but eventually he decides to release his cards and fold. So we get to drag in a nice little pot here.
I don't know if the UK allows online voting.
So in this next interesting hand, there is an open from under the gun to $20. The cutoff calls, the small blind calls, and then we look down in the big blind with ace king offsuit. So we decide to put in the squeeze here to $130. The under the gun player then pretty quickly makes the fold. The cutoff tanks before also making the fold, but then the small blind, who is the action villain who's already made this episode of the vlog a couple of times, decides to continue with the call. So I should note that the video may look a little bit different in this hand, as I decided to change seats so that I could hopefully give you guys a better view of the action. Right, so we are now going heads up to the flop, and the flop comes 9-3-3 rainbow. Villain in the small blind starts with the check, which is pretty standard, and I think this flop is very interesting because this flop should favor our range quite significantly. We have all the overpairs here that have any kind of one pair type holdings pretty much crushed on a paired flop, and this should be actually shaping up to be quite a nice situation for us to be triple barreling here with a hand like ace king. My main concern is that although in theory this would be the correct play or the standard play, the villain in question is someone who is quite a loose player, and he does call down quite light, and is someone who's generally not that easy to bluff. So with this in mind, I still on balance decided to go for a c-bet here and at least double barrel, and if we do get called, hope to at least see some good turn or river cards for us to continue barreling. I decide to continue with a c-bet of $100. Villain then pretty much snap calls. So we are now off to the turn card, and the turn comes an offsuit queen. Villain now snap checks. I think this is a great turn card for us to continue barreling. The worst cards from villain's perspective would be an ace or king or a queen, as we have a ton of ace king, ace queen, and king queen type combos in our squeezing range here. So for this reason, I now decide to double barrel and size up to $250. Villain then pretty much snap calls. So I'm like, what the hell, bro? Just fold, man. So we are now off to the river card, and then the river just comes like a low card brick. Villain snap checks, and now the action's on me. This should be theoretically a triple barrel, but given the villain in question, to be honest with you, I really felt like I was going to get looked up here, which is precisely why I think I would only be triple barreling here if I had the goods, and I don't think I'll be bluffing here, especially versus this opponent. I decided to check back, and then villain showed Jack 9 offsuit for a flopped top pair. So yeah, not surprised to see this hand, and unfortunately we're going to be losing this big pot. I think at this point we've been playing for like a couple of hours or so, and the table has now transformed into the rock game, so we are now going to be playing 2-5-10 for the remainder of our session. There is an open from early position to $25. The action then falls to the middle position player, who is the action player, and he decides to come along for a call. The action is now on me in the low jack, and I look down at ace queen offsuit. Now just a note on stack sizes, the early position opener is like 2k deep, but the villain in middle position is playing kind of short stacked with about $300. So with this in mind, I think I'd like to go for a 3-bet here, and if somehow we find ourselves in a situation where the middle position then decides to jam, I won't be folding here and I will be seeing him at the river. So I decide to put in the squeeze here to $110. The action then falls to the button, who's quite a solid player, and he decides to cold call my 3-bet for 110. The action then folds back to the pre-flop opener, who goes into the tank before also deciding to make the call. The action is now back on the middle position action man player, and he pretty much snap jams the rest of his stacking for $303. I'm actually really pleased to see this jam because it does now reopen the betting, and ace queen here definitely doesn't want to go multi-way, especially when we're not guaranteed position. So I now decide to go into the tank to decide on my 4-bet sizing. So it's not necessary to be committing a large portion of our stack here in this 4-bet. I think close to a min click or a little bit over is just fine. I decide to put in a 4-bet squeeze to $650. The button quickly folds, early position also quickly folds. So we are now going all the way to the river with this action man. The dealer puts out the flop, deals the turn, and then deals the river, and we don't improve on any street whatsoever. And villain tables 5 deuce of diamonds for a straight. So yeah, trying to find some merit in villain's decision making here. At least he's got someone like me who's got over 2k in my stack to isolate him in an all-in situation with the extra $220 in the pot, but not sure about getting it in with 5 high. Nice hand. Let's move on. In this hand, there is an open from under the gun to $30. The action then folds all the way to me on the button, and I look down at Jack 10 of clubs. So in this spot, I think I mix between 3-betting and calling, and on this occasion, I decide to go for the more aggressive route and 3-bet to $100. The action then folds all the way back to the under the gun player, who doesn't think for too long before making the call. So we are now going heads up to the flop, and the flop comes King 5-8 with 1 club. Villain from under the gun decides to start with a check, and in this spot, given we are seeing a king high board, which should typically favor us a lot more than it does for villain, and especially given we've got the 8 of clubs on the flop, I decide to start with a c-bet of $75. Villain then doesn't think for too long before making the call. So we are now off to the turn card, which I think just comes like a brick. Villain now decides to snap check. Now I think it's important to control your bluffing frequencies. I think there are a lot of turn cards which I would have continued barreling, but this turn card is not one of them. So therefore I decide to check back. So we are now off to a free river card, which comes an offsuit 10. Villain now decides to lead out for $100. Yeah, so given the way we played a hand, I think he should be able to value bet quite comfortably hands as weak as queens or jacks, in addition to his king x hands. So for that reason, it does put us in a semi-tough situation. So after going into a tank for a while, and especially knowing that Wade on my right is sweating his hand with me, didn't want to disappoint him. So I decided to flick in the call. And on this occasion, Villain showed pocket 7s. So we show our hand for the winner, and we now get to drag in this pot.
I would lean fold, I would take my time, and then I would have called as well. So.
In this next hand, there is an open from early position to $30. The action folds to the small blind, who is the rock in this game, and by the way, is also Wade. He decides to make the call, and then I look down in the big blind with 10-9 offsuit. So very defendable hand here, so I also decide to make the call and see a flop. On the flop, the dealer puts out 9 king deuce rainbow. Small blind checks, and in this spot, I like mixing in some leads from time to time with one pair type hands to deny some equity versus some ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 type holdings, which the early position player could have. So for this reason, I decide to lead out for a small sizing of $30. The early position player now goes into the tank, and after thinking for a little while, he decides to put in a raise to $110. Action folds back to the small blind, who thinks for a little while, pondering his options before eventually folding, and now the action's back on me. So I think this spot's quite interesting because I think Villain has now correctly identified my line of thinking in his hand, and given that it's a king high board, it's quite hard for us to have quite strong king X hands here. So I think Villain has made a good raise here, regardless of what hands he has. I think it's correct if Villain defines his raising range here to be king X hands, over pairs, and hands like ace queen or ace jack. I think we'd make really good bluffs here to mix in with his value hands. In terms of the very strongest hands, i.e. sets, I think in this spot we have more sets than Villain does. Even though Villain can have pocket kings in this spot, I think like 95% of the time, kings would always be flatting here, given it's such a dry board, and just let me continue barreling turn and river, and I think that's probably the best way to max value there. So all of this is currently running through my mind while I'm deciding what to do here. So I think calling here is probably the worst option out of raising, calling and folding, and given that I think it's extremely likely that Villain is going to have pocket kings in the spot, and we could very easily have nines or deuces, I decide to turn this hand into a bluff. I decide to put in a 3-bet on this flop to $300. As soon as I put the chips in, Villain in early position, who is actually Lance, who I've actually played with quite a bit already during my time in Blackhawk, he then immediately says, "Oh, you got deuces?"
Twos? You got twos?
He's smiling, and he's also struggling as well with his decision before eventually deciding to fold. So then I then tell him, no, I don't have a deuce, and I'll prove it. I flash the 10 in my hand, and then he goes, nice hand. So not a massive pot, but quite a fun one nonetheless.
No, I don't.
You'll see it on the vlog in a week.
Oh, nice bet.
I needed one of those. That was one of I had queen jack.
Now we come on to the final interesting slash, in this case, fun hand from my 2-5 session last week. In this hand, there is a limp from under the gun, who is Wade in this hand, for $10. I am now next to act, and I look down at 9-7 of clubs. So I decide to put in a raise to $40. The action now falls to a middle position player who makes the call. The button calls, the under the gun player also calls. We are now going 4 ways to the flop, which comes king 9-4 with 1 club. Action checks to me, and in this spot, although it's a king high board, which should favor me a lot more than the other players in this hand, we are 4 ways, which would decrease the frequency at which I would be c-bet bluffing. But given that we do have a pair and a backdoor flush draw, it tipped the scales for me to continue for a c-bet. So I decided to put in a small c-bet of $50. Fortunately for me, middle position folds, the button folds, which is looking even better for me, but unfortunately, the under the gun player makes the call. So we are now heads up to the turn card, and the turn comes the 7 of spades. So we now turn a very disguised 2 pair. Under the gun checks, and in this spot, I think this hand wants to double barrel for a large sizing. So after I go into the tank just to decide on bet sizings, I eventually settle on a sizing of $175. Villain then on the gun, he's like, oh, that's a really nice bet. And before folding, Wade then showed me that he had 6-5 of clubs for an open ender.
3, 8.
Good bet, good bet.
Right, so that now concludes all the interesting hands from my session last Monday. When all was said and done, we ended the session down $454. Because variance has not really been quite in our favor, we managed to end last week up just $55. I hope you've enjoyed the scenery, hope you've enjoyed the poker. Take care, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.